here to talk to us about. Okay, just wanted to introduce Matthew, who is here to talk about his book, The Architectural Model, which he wrote, which I have a copy of right here, which is a very interesting book about how, sorry, this thing is, got it. I had to approve the recording, sorry. But no, which is a very interesting book about sort of models. I've gotten through most of it. It's pretty thorough book, Matthew, but it's very interesting. It's very comprehensive, and it brings up a lot of the sort of the things that we talk about daily. How we build models, why we build models, and really sort of explores those aspects. And I would highly suggest getting a copy. It's very interesting as a model builder to be reading it. And here's Matthew. I hope that was an okay introduction, Matthew. I'm not very good at them.
Why not? So, as I said, I'm an architect by training until I began my PhD in 2000. So for the past 20 years, I did work in practice a few times, but I've mostly been studying architectural history and theory. But most of my interests have always surrounded the design process and the imagination. I have a kind of a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen, and it explains some of the background, how we get focused onto thinking about models and how the book came about in a bit. So let me see, I'm going to share my screen, and let me see one of these ways. Here it is. Da, 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 da. So most of what I'm interested in is about the architectural model, and it's the way we use it in the different ways, which is, and I'll kind of get to, these are some of my own models that I've constructed over time, and they're very different in sorts. And I constructed them during my student career. So one of the things I did was that I did my undergraduate at Penn State University, and I did it in both architecture, and then I did a separate degree in philosophy. But then I did my master's at the University of Pennsylvania in 1998, 99. There I met a guy by the name of David Leatherborough, who just finished writing a piece for the Harvard Design Review. And he reformulated a kind of a quote that was being tossed around by a couple scholars, by the name of Robin Evans and Joseph Rickwert, and which says, poets make poems, painters make paintings, and musicians music. Architects, however, do not make architecture. They make drawings and models of it. Representations meant to direct the development of something conceived into something constructed. And I'm like, seems to be a really important thing to be talking about as architects, if we don't actually make the dang buildings. Shouldn't we be talking about how we're using these really important tools? So the first thing to understand, and it was there, and one of the things was probably this model in the middle, and I have it here. And when I was at University of Pennsylvania, I went there to work with a studio instructor who we had to make models with no glue. And any good model maker knows that you have to release yourself to the material and find out what it wants to be. Stupidly, I picked oak. Oak doesn't cut straight. Oak has a thick grain. Oak wants to do very, very specific things. And I learned, so then I got involved with, I started working in the material imagination and how we think about that, because as a determinate ground for thinking about thoughts. So anyway, let's put some of that aside and try to understand the topic that we're talking about. So we understand an architectural model, typically the dictionary definition is a physical three-dimensional representation of a building. These are all architectural models, or so we're told. However, they're all radically different. Very different. I mean, we have a crab shell that was an architectural model. Bubbles. So that definition seems to be fairly useless. And I would propose it's a three-dimensional object that is interpreted as embodying the formal, spatial, material, or structural characteristics of a proposed or existing structure. And this interpretation is key to how we think about its uses. So a model is not a model in itself, but it must be interpreted in one. And that means that my cup can be a model. It can be anything, in that way can be a model. It describes, depicting or describe an existing or proposed structure in a variety of ways. It can be its form, the material and structure. It could be the facture, which is a funny term we use to describe how two things are joined together. And that's, the facture of a thing. Or it's figurative associations, which is something that Peter Eisenman was exploring when he was doing his cardboard architecture of the late 60s and early 70s. That the cardboard model was the exemplar for his early house designs. The first act requires that the user to see material things in themselves. And that to do this is we use phenomenology. And we look at Edmund Husserl, who established the school of phenomenology. The term phenomenology comes from appearance and study of, or reason. So phenomena and logos. Phenomena is anything that exists of which the mind is conscious, the reflecting of light. And I usually refer to these sort of phenomenal effects, like just that we take for granted, like the reflecting of light off of surfaces, the rebounding of rubber going back and forth. And there was a guy, Sergio Musmeci, who used rubber as the stretching of rubber as a modeling material, the fraying of rope, melting of ice, or the smell of asphalt when it rains. These are phenomena. For a model, it's the physical qualities, the effects, the affects themselves. So in everyday experience, Husserl suggested there is, and I'm not going to do too heavy into this, so don't worry, it's going to be very philosophical, but natural, and he says there's two attitudes. We have a natural attitude, an everyday experience, and a phenomenologic one. Natural attitudes are our routine frames of mind and the taken for granted every day, our beliefs or assumptions. The sun is going to rise, the gravity is going to hold us to the ground. Phenomenological is our belief in a natural attitude. It's connected to this epoche, which means it's bracketing. And it's critical where we have an attitude towards our experience, which we understand things that underlines the ground of our experience, because before we understand it as a cup, it is a hard cylindrical piece of earth, baked earth. And when we peel away cup, we are left with that. And it's that we interpret when we use a thing as a model. So modeling thus is like a game of make-believe. And children engage in this all the time. Make-believe begins when you have epoche, or phenomenological reduction. You get rid of its accidental meanings. It's a heaping pile of snow. And you ask, what is it? And you treat that heaping pile of snow as if it was a castle. You engage with the material form as if it was the building. So you engage with a crab shell as if it is a model for the structural roof solution to Le Corbusier's chapel in Ronchamp. And you ask, what if? Designing with models engages with the what if. What if it's this? You speculate. What if it's not Staples? What if this is the building form? So this is critical. And our different way we use models is that we engage with a kind of, oftentimes with a bracketing, the phenomenological reduction to see the thing as it is, and then begin to speculate on what if and treating a thing as if. So the as if really involves what we familiarly know as understanding scale. And our origins of scale really came from early BC. There's a great example when the Egyptian pharaoh Amasis wanted to build a pyramid higher than Cheops. Apparently Herodotus, if I have this right, Herodotus, who was basically the father of history, was traveling around the Mediterranean. And that's one of the things we often get wrong, is that the Mediterranean cultures, Egypt, Mycenae, Minoa, and around the Mediterranean, they were not isolated. They were sailing and trading and talking to each other. So Herodotus was there, and Amasis apparently wanted to build a pyramid higher than Cheops, but didn't know what the measures were. So Thales, and this is passed down through a few people, set up a walking stick at the edge of the shadow of a pyramid. And so what he does is he says basically the proportional measure between my stick and the shadow, I can measure these out. I can measure the shadow, and therefore I can proportionally get if this, then that, a proportional ratio. So what does he do? He sets up a scale model and uses the length of the shadow at the sun to basically calculate a comparison in size between the two. He sets up a scale. The term model comes from the German model to the Italian modello and to the Latin modulus. A modulus, one of my pictures didn't show. All right. A modulus is a measure, and it's a small measure, typically a module. We know of the existence of using measures, and they're typically human measures since ancient Egypt. And the Egyptians have this length of a cubit or the palms. And of course, then they would make a rod because everybody realized everybody has different size hands. So, because what they would do is they'd lay out hands on a building site. It's 5 palms wide, five palms wide, but my palms are bigger than yours. So they couldn't construct anything. We know by looking at, and this middle picture here, which is not showing, let me see if it shows, there it is, we can see evidence for the use of geometry and measurements and chords to laying out cathedrals. We also have found these very funny ostracon shards of limestone upon which are these very strange drawings. And what these were actually measurements of how high to measure up each time on palms and cubits to make the curvature of a vault. We've also found, and there was really a wonderful woman, her name's Ulrike Fauerbach, and she went largely unnoticed by a lot of my scholars in the history of architectural models, and that she found, we have two evidence. First off, there was all these little tiny column capitals and columns that they thought were decorative objects, and they were imperfect, so they kind of discarded them. And her research was on ancient Egyptian column construction techniques. And so she picks up one of these things, it takes another look at them, and realizes that they're describing variations on either side of the column. And also at times you could rotate them on 4 sides. It shows how to actually develop carving one of these column capitals. So they were models for either for testing out designs or for practicing or for demonstrating them to someone else how to make it. The fascinating thing is that they're also were made out of limestone versus the full size columns in Egypt were made out of sandstone. Sandstone, as you know, is a much softer material. Limestone is harder. It would be silly for you to be making one of these tiny columns out of sandstone because you couldn't get the kind of precise edges that you could out of limestone. We also found, this was fascinating, this little model here, which is the description of a tomb substrate, pyramid substrate. It basically shows a kind of a tomb, the layout of a tomb. And there was a wood block, I believe, in here, which was the big stone block that would slide into place to seal the tomb up after it was being closed. It depicts the layout of rooms underground, but it's kind of compressed. So there might be larger distances between some of these pieces, but it shows the layout to describe to a patron how it's going to be done. Crazy thing is, then they sit there just outside the entrance to the tomb. There's a courtyard, and underneath one of the stones, they found it buried there. And I'm like, why are you doing this? It's just like, hey, I'm leaving a map of how to get into the tomb outside, so you'll find it. But it was really kind of silly. One of these funny things that I think about. So the term, when we get to modulus, it's really about these measures. And we always use to kind of measure in a grid to help us as a small measure as a unit. That unit was often determined by our physical bodies. It's on the site of any building construction, the Middle Ages, because it was always a proportional system rather than a strict, laid out design system. And this has to do with a lot of ideas about religion, about structures representing the divine order of the universe, since they were mostly religious structures. And even that goes all the way through Christianity. So this is a really famous, it's not, we kind of call it a model because it's really a plan. It's an ideal plan on the left of how to design a monastery. And it was found in St. Gallen, the border of Switzerland and Austria, and a monastery there. And it's sort of an idealized version of, and it says where everything should be laid out if you're going to build a monastery. And we can see that everything was laid out based upon a kind of measurement, and it always followed this. These measurements, they would be on site, and then the builder would take, a mason would take the measurement off of the compass, and they would use that for designing everything. It then got that, and that term, the module, modellus, we find in the drawings, modulatorum, I believe is the term, and it becomes the root word when we come to modello. Modello, which was first used in surrounding the Brunelleschi's, not Brunelleschi, but the Florence Duomo competition, the competition for how to actually make that dome over the Florence cathedral. And because it was so big, no one knew, all the knowledge about how to build vaults at that size without centering was lost since ancient Rome. So of course, Brunelleschi, and I won't go into depth, Brunelleschi says that he proposes a competition because people generally don't trust him, and he's worried that the commission, they're going to use him for his information and give the commission to someone like Ghiberti, and who was like the favored child in Florence. So in the competition, the payment receipts for models, this is the first time we see the word modello. And it is the term with the modello, it's a description of a three-dimensional description of how the modules are laid out in the dome. A drawing, modulatorum, I believe is the term, don't have it off the top of my head, is really the two-dimensional description of the modules in a plan. So that's how it comes into the Italian language. And on the right, and I explain this in the book in more detail, during the competition, if you look at all the accounts, there was a moment where Brunelleschi said fine, and him and the other Capamaestro were demonstrating their idea about how to build the vault, and Brunelleschi demonstrates it using this sort of herringbone technique. But I believe that he found this when him and Donatello were down in Rome excavating some of the ancient Roman ruins and the brick sizes, etc. And he builds a small model to demonstrate how he's going to do it. Recently, they found in some excavations nearby, they found this model buried. And I believe it might have been actually Brunelleschi's model. It just that was on the building site and got destroyed. My theory. It took about 100 years. And so a younger gentleman by the name of Leon Battista Alberti's hanging out, has been around, and Brunelleschi, as he's getting older, he hears the stories, he learns about Brunelleschi's modeling, the way he uses models and the practice. And one should understand, Brunelleschi is very cautious about, there's all these wonderful stories about Brunelleschi and how he doesn't want people to know too much about his ideas because he thinks and then he's obsolete. So he's overly protective. At this time, we also see the emergence of, and it was in the original payment sheets for these payment receipts for these models that were entered into the competition, that woodworkers, who are really the ones who did the armatures for vaults, they did decorative cornices and stuff out of wood in the churches, and these Sansovino frames that they were put in churches around artwork on the walls and pulpits, etc. They start, because they were modeling things these columns and capitals and cornices in miniature, they think, well, I can become an architect too. They're the ones that were paid to make the models for the competition. Well, so there's a problem here. Anybody knows if you can make a slick model, they can get a job. And so Alberti says this, he sets this out, and it comes from inspiring from Brunelleschi. Models should be plain and simple so that you appreciate the idea of the design and not the hand of the model maker. So that idea that models should be plain and simple extends for 500 years as the standard practice, especially for design, until a project reaches a very late stage of the work where it's ready to go to be constructed, because then it becomes the guide to be followed. We know this, it took about 100 years for this idea to go across the Alps. One understands in architectural history, just because something happens up in northern Germany in 1200 doesn't mean the same thing's going on down the south of France at the same time. Things don't move as fast as they do. So we see this in an amazing place which we all should visit, and I have yet to go there, is Augsburg, Germany. Of strangely, I don't know why. And there's a guy there, they suddenly have this modeling explosion. Everybody is making models, and it comes into, I went and looked at how the word came into the German language as Modell, and it comes in through as kind of like, it was like very fashionable to call plaster, these wax forms for, or cast, or the plaster cast for jewelers models. Oh, do you have that Modello? And so it goes into German as Modell, as a very fashionable thing to call it. And so we get from Modello to Modell. And we notice it exactly this time. Here's an example, Adolf Daucher. It's not the first model that we have. We have an earlier one for the Perlach-Turm, Lugensland-Turm. And it is basically, we see on the left is a very plain and simple model. And here it's in its ideal form. All the turrets are the same size. Everything, there's no windows, no cornices on it. And then we see that by the same architects, the final model for the same tower. The turrets are all different. It has windows, it has a cornice around it. So at this time, in this transition of this term, the word for architectural model, at least as a draft, is called a Visierung. Visierung is a very funny word. In the German, it refers to the sight on a gun through which you look to what you're aiming. They would call some drawings Visierung. It's like a draft sketch, but now it's this guide. So we look through the model to the place that we're aiming. I prefer this understanding of a model, at least in design practices, because it really kind of connects something to our understanding of what we're doing with these things. So then this goes on well into about the 19th, way through the 19th up until the 20th century, which is where I became interested in architectural models at about the turn of the 20th century, when architects started using models in a very different way. And we have Christopher Wren. This is this great model of the St. Paul's Cathedral. And this is a classic example of what happens if you over detail a design model before it's ready to go to construction. You open yourself up to criticism. And he did. He made this beautiful model. And if you can get inside, you can even find this on Google Street View. If you can go there and walk through this thing, it's great. And but he opens himself up to criticism, and these patrons came in and they started nitpicking things and taking it this and telling that don't like this, I'm gonna do this way. And the next thing you know, it's considered the most beautiful church in London, but it's not actually ever been built. So there's that. So these are all models. We started using them in different ways, figuratively, as form finding. I mean, Mies van der Rohe is using, I think he says it's glass and celluloid to construct. He's hanging this model outside of his studio window, rotating the piece of glasses in the sunlight, because he realizes that he's searching for the new way of working with glass, which is really about the transparency and opacity. No one's really spent the time to look at this, but I think if we know what walking around buildings during the daytime, that a window is going to become very opaque because of the way the sun hits it, or very transparent the way it goes through it. And I always wondered if that was somehow part of that play that he was playing with this building, but no one's really built the model, tried to sit down in the sunlight and see what he's trying to understand as you walk around it. Let's see what else I got here. These, as we know, really begin to go, are more like if it's your own. There's something through which we look at that which we aim. There's things that help us think. And Kurt Schwitters makes this cathedral model. He really is trying to reorient the Bauhaus Crystal Cathedral, which was to be the idea of creating a building that could act like a crystal and an exemplar for the designing of all things. And he said, no, let's take all things and assemble them into a new architecture. So he says, and the gears were meant to describe the imagination of the user and the people who were going to do this new architecture, because they were grinding up the identities of it being a cup to see it as a cylindrical piece of baked clay in order to find a new use for it as, I don't know whatever it is in the building. That's another lecture. So anyway, I was very interested in some of these ideas. I set out the oldest, we had probably the most often referenced work was by a guy by the name of Ludwig Heidenreich, and it was that was done in the 1930s, and it was really an encyclopedia entry. And he had he's the only one who sort of tried to sort of break down its different uses, and it was very, I should have included a slide about this, very inaccurate and almost, and didn't deal with all the problems that we have and all the different types. So at the time when I began this, these are all the books that were really out there about architectural models. These are the ones that were in English. So, and I have a couple architecture historians who are, one of them is from German, and you'll hear from her in a couple weeks, which are with us today. And the architectural historians, I mean, the classic one is this up here. It's all written in their own native languages. It's almost like they didn't want English speaking audience to have all this information. And it's sort of like it's kept in a very tight scholarly environment. And of all of these, this is the only one who deals with theoretically questions about models. And it's really, he goes into a very kind of, he's dealing with the architectural model as a thinking machine, and that's it. So my book is that I've been working on I've been following it. I've been following all the publications, German, French, Italian, Middle Ages to the present, archaeological journals. And I've been carrying this with me, and every time some new publication comes out, I've been interested. And my goal is to bring all the material together, reflect upon it, and try to produce a new sort of taxonomy for the different way we use models. So the problem I face is like, how do you organize this? So these are all crazy different type of models, John Soane, the Cork models, these models that were found in like the Augsburg archives, which were technical devices that were put there as demonstrations that people could come and study. Friato's soap bevel models, the clay models, paper folded models. Yeah. So the first thing I did is I divided it in the book, and the book follows this. You have, okay, the first half of the book can be models that we make for other people. We'll put them over here. And then we have models that are made for or by and for architects, the ones we make for, designers make for ourselves. And that then ends up, the problem with that though, is that sometimes these go over here and sometimes those go over there. So it's never perfect, but it became an interesting point, because yes, like the Tivoli Temple Vesta Tivoli became a model for John Soane for his Bank of England project, the Tivoli corner, and vice versa. So the first 3 chapters of the book were models of existing structures, a funny chapter that people don't totally enjoy. Well, I've had some criticism, but I think it's a fantastic chapter, and it deals with questions about models such as, these moments where we're playing and we're looking for inspiration. So we do something in the model we know is not buildable, but we're just searching for information. And I'm like, well, what are those? And I really look at these notions of the oniric, the dream. This fetishization on like, why in Germany are there all these blue foam models? Where did that come from? Suddenly we're like, well, they think that if it's made this way, it's going to be great. Also modeling collections. The more models I have, the better, I will be. And that was John Soane. And it's like, I have to have all these plaster casts and model around because that helps me become a better designer. I'm insured to do it. In plain and simple form, descriptive tools, models we make for other people. Everything from record scale, the preferred tool. A client will want a model because the architects would die, and they wanted to make sure that things is going to get finished. And there's a long history of problems with that, all the way from the Cathedral Florence Duomo, and you find beautiful models up in Belgium that are just, when they never did get finished. Michelangelo built a huge, gigantic model of the dome to make sure it would be done after his death. Plain and simple form is that tradition that follows all the way from Bruno, all the way from Alberti, all the way up through the present. Modeling materials medium, that's like model the material propriety. Why it's ideas where you'll often ask, well, why did you make that out of cardboard when you're trying to show mass? And why isn't it a solid mass? Or form findings, such as the bubble model, Sergio Musmeci, stretching neoprene rubber, and these things. And then the one that was very difficult for me as an architectural teacher of design, I also teach design, is conceptual models, which is what I began with, because I started this whole thing way back on my master's, the end of my master's, and I came to my PhD, and I was going, for some reason, architects make models that don't look like buildings, but we are projecting architectural ideas with them. And I wanted to try to understand how that works. There are allegorical models, there are analogical models, and I call these type of models anagogical models. It's a bit contentious because architectural historians tend to see, it's very difficult for them to see a term that's connected to biblical interpretation being used to describe model interpretation. And my job when I did my dissertation was to show how it originally was always related to the final cause, which is the final cause or the accidental meanings of this thing as it's a cup to hold something, where I interpret it as a modeling material. I stop seeing its purpose, its use as something else, and I interpret it as something else. And so that's me. That's how I got to this.
That's pretty cool. No,
it's a great book. Lots of pictures.
It is a good book. I think it's really, you have some really interesting parts of it that come out. I like the one thing that I as I was reading it, the Tiny Alice play, I thought that was a great, sort of.
Yeah, that was the dream
idea.
by the model.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that, how so I can't remember who the author is. I should look it up, but you talked about the sort of Tiny Alice play where there's a model inside of a castle, and sort of they react to the actual
and then the
building
people
versus
treat the
the
model as if it's the house, and
Yep.
that there's a tiny Alice of the actual. There's a woman Alice who's the owner of the house, and there's a tiny Alice in the model, and they treat the two as if it was the real thing. It's sort of funny.
It was really funny. It was an interesting, just that concept and pulling that in. I'm like, wow, that's, you think about it, and if there's a model in a house, you understand how the whole house works, at that point. I think about like the
Yeah,
model at the there's a model at the Opera House in Paris that shows sort of the whole inner workings of it, and you're like, I walk up to it and I'm like, I understand the whole building now, and I think that's an
yeah.
interesting sort of aspect of it.
We're in a very interesting phase right now. So what I was interested in, which I'm not sure if any of you guys in the audience are doing this, is the augmented reality models. And which is, I was curious about it, which is my colleague gave me a pair of glasses to put on that were connected to the computer, and he just tossed a digital model on a table next to me. And it does come out. The problem is that you're missing, our voice gives us gives us an understanding of the physicality of things around us. The space is missing in this augmented reality model.
Mhm.
I don't have the vibrations or sense of that thing really occupying it's a physical space. Because I always wondered, why can we not replace these physical models? Why? I mean, sure, you've all heard this. Is it, oh, these computer tools. Remember the 90s,
Yeah.
the digital fly throughs,
Yeah.
and then it's like that disappeared.
Yeah.
And then we're now dealing with the 3D printed mono-material models, which I argue with my students, is like, it's just one material. It's not telling you anything yet. And the augmented reality is fascinating, but it's the kinesthetic understanding we have of it as an object in space related to us is missing. And I think we will never get away from the physicality that we have of it. So I mean, I'm very interested in the physical model,
Yeah.
like many of us are here.
Yeah,
So,
it's that sort of, I can reach out and touch it, that sort of
yeah,
thing. I've always wondered, I've always been asked that question of, how do we integrate new technology into sort of what we do? And I think that's
right.
always an interesting question of, sort of what's the next step of that modeling. But it always comes back to sort of being able to physically touch it, or just the idea of even being able to physically touch it, I think changes sort of what it is. And at least for me, and my understanding of it.
Yeah, it's this, I think someday I'm going to try to really write something, and it becomes a very philosophical question to be able to understand, unpack that, or because it's really about perception, and to try to unpack what this nature is that we're experiencing with the feeling of the space in it. I've dealt with questions about the accidental interpretation, and some of my papers about finding something serendipitously and seeing it as a model for the building that goes all the way back to ancient Rome, where Vitruvius talks about Callimachus, who in the invention of the Corinthian capital, there was a young maiden of Corinth who died at a young age, and her handmaiden took her favorite things, put them in a basket, set it on top of her grave, and then put 2 clay roof tiles on top to cover it. Over time, there was on her grave there was an acanthus root, and the basket was placed on top, and it grew up around it. That's an assemblage of found objects.
Yep.
And Callimachus is walking around engaged in the problem, and just with the term means crafty and or skillful. And he comes walking by and sees this novel assemblage and sees in it a capital, and then immediately starts to take down the measures, etc., and draws up the Corinthian type. So there's these serendipitous moments, which the physicality of the world we have with things. That's part of that process. Yeah.
And I think you talk about it too in the book, where you talk about sort of, hold on, let me see, I have a note here, where your found materials, you sort of remove everyday associations, and then the imagination can freely sort of speculate. I look at that and saying that, that's something that we do every day as model builders, is, looking for something to represent that shape, or looking for something to represent that, what that's
Oh
going to
yeah,
look
I
like.
bet you do.
And I think
It's
it's,
cool.
like
Save
wandering
me
around the
some
halls of
time, right?
wandering around the halls of Home Depot, looking for like, a pipe that will bend the right way. Or, I think of my favorite one was designers brought me a chandelier, and we want to represent this in a space, but we don't want to buy the chandelier. Can you make it? And it was 8-inch glass hand blown spheres And I'm like, how do I model that? I found beach balls, clear beach balls that were around the same size, taped them together in the cloud. We hung them in the ceiling, and it was a perfect representation. And the client understood it immediately, understood the design concept, understood how it would look in the space. And I thought that was really interesting, because I had to break away from thinking glass spheres to what's similar, or what can I use that would, if we strip that away,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. I
So
completely agree with you on this.
yeah.
There's, and I'm going to plug this woman. So if you have any more questions, and then I'm going to sort of say there is two things. There's a lot of new work that's just, so part of what I wanted to do with this book is create a ground, a kind of a bait to help bring all this information so that people could really build on the research and go forward. And there is a lot neat new work continuing to evolve, and it's coming out. I've begun to realize that by doing this, people are bringing to the fore some much more interest in additional interesting research and ideas that are expanding upon. There's a bunch of new little publications that have come out, and people are starting to write more and to do more about it. So it's getting to be, it's just shocking to me that it's taken so gosh darn long. I got to a point about, I guess now it was 6 years ago, and I just said, I'm just going to do this. And I sat down and just started writing and trying to pull everything together. And it was, and then reflect upon it, expand it. Yeah, so like to go ahead and plug a friend of mine that I've never met, who's in the audience, Teresa Fonconnell, will be speaking to you hopefully, I believe, soon. She has an absolutely fantastic book coming out on your all of your ancestor, Theodore Conrad. So this plain and simple model approach really goes on until the beginning of the 20th century, and it starts to, the changes happen because of expressionism, Dadaism, and above all, constructivism that's going on in Russia that begins to be exhibited. And it changes the way, all of these events start changing the way we look at our materials and the representation of their use. And it's connected to the imagination. And then that leads to using more, and also the World War brings about more materials, perspex, or what you call plexiglass. And in the United States, there's cardboard models. I mean, have you seen these early 20th century, the model, they told people to make a drawing and fold it into a box. Yep. so that you can unfold it, and it was like you could put it into your drawer when you're done.
Flat pack it. Yep.
Like, yeah, it was crazy. And then we have the Great Depression. So architects go out of work, and they end up becoming model makers. And you have this wonderful man that Teresa's going to talk about to you, which is on Theodore Conrad. I became interested in Australia. I just presented a paper looking at why they use these models in the 1940s and 50s as advertising tools to appeal to, above all, women. They're in women's magazines. And it was the closest exemplar before the very highly detailed models was the dollhouse. And they were really trying to appeal to as a marketing tool. So it becomes an object from design to an object of consumption. And people like it, as we know, because you can hold it in your hand like an appliance and take it home with you. I'm sure you all have this experience with clients who see they want the physical thing. It seems more present as a project.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, you were talking about those models, in the 50s of like, the salesman model, that people would go and, this is what it is. You can physically touch it, but yeah.
Yeah. And there's these wonderful images out there from that period of time, because they would include them or take photographs and include them in the advertisements as a way. And there's these crazy pictures of people looking at a model like, have any of you seen Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's interesting because even still today, like you can go to the sporting goods store and see a model of the tent, that's there, and all these other things that everybody's like,
That's
oh,
great.
look
I
at,
never
I
thought
mean, it's
about
like
that.
you really see them everywhere. It's amazing. So I mean, I love that there's so many different aspects of modeling, and I love that you've sort of put them together and tried to categorize them in a way, and I think it's pretty good.
Let me
Um,
pull up a picture for you as you're
sure.
going on. I'm listening. Go ahead.
No, I was going to
These are
ask if
my
anybody else had any questions. We've got probably about 10 minutes left on here, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Does
There it
anybody have
is.
a question for Matthew? Oh, there we go. Edward?
Well, my question was, I'm sort of kind of curious on how, uh, if any of these models were made for like mass production for like, take, like the White House in the United States. I mean, it's one of those things of, there's many different variations of the same structure to say, hey, this is what what this is. And
Oh
are
yeah,
any of these models are made like, have
totally.
any of those?
Yeah, paradigma. The early Greek and Roman sculptures. So it's fascinating. If you look at the in Athens, you look at the Acropolis. We often think that. I mean, I did for years that all Ionic capitals are the same, but they're not. I'm like, how could you variation in it? On the Acropolis, there's 3 structures with Ionic capitals, and if you look at them, they're all different. And they were treated as sculptures, really. And it was a sculptor. There was no architect then. It was the sculptor who he or she made one capital and said, this is it, you guys copy it. And they would take measurements off of it and then make the copies. Funny thing, there's a round temple. They find one of the earliest Corinthian capitals, probably the second one that was made. There's a temple of Apollo in which there was like one Corinthian capital. They see as the first one sitting in the middle of the temple inside, like as if it was the god sitting there, and no one knows what it's doing. But there was this Tholos of Epidaurus, I think is what it was called, and they found a Corinthian capital buried next to the temple, and no one knows what the situation with it was. I read recently in a new report says there were imperfections compared to the originals. So either A, it was the paradigma, or it was B, it was a mason who screwed up. There is a tradition in masonry. Apparently, if a stonemason messes up a stone, that he has to sit there and witness 2 of his peers come along with stretcher, put the stone in the stretcher, carry it away, and bury it as if it was a living thing, and return it to the earth. So we don't know, but yeah, and it goes. What's interesting is that when we go from paradigma to prototype, in which the prototypes become things we experiment on and test and start to develop into making production, to be saying this is okay, we've developed this prototype now, that is going to be the one that we copy. So we end up doing that through a kind of testing process. But yeah, totally, there's a long tradition that really architects do this all the time with their buildings, and they become much more experimental. And we would set up full-size models on the building site because a client didn't understand what's going on. There were often some architects wanted to do them, but in reality, they were very expensive to build and to look at. If you put up a cornice up at the full height, but we have a long tradition of doing that, as we know, on building sites, where the architect would want to see how the builder's going to make something. And that becomes, and we can talk about it and test it. And you still see them on building sites today.
Yeah, we still do them. Yep.
But you're going to find, I think, when with Theodore Conrad, he's the one who goes about developing different techniques for mass producing modeling materials and things like that. for reproducing too. He's one of the earliest that kind of gets involved with this. What's fascinating that no one's looked at is I can't figure out when we started putting human figures in models. I found something in the early 19th century, and I mentioned it in the book, but it's which somebody is an advertising model. I think it was 19th century houses. He had little people in it showing how great it is, but we really don't find them in there. Just neat. Another funny thing.
I always think it's interesting that we put them in there just because, I mean, usually it's for the understanding of scale, and usually it's for like a public model for people who generally, so it's not usually for the architect. It's probably would fall into your first column where we're building it for the public, or we're building it. I mean, granted, sometimes it's for architects who don't quite understand scale, but other times, I mean, I find that too. I don't know about you, Alistair, but if you find do you put it in, do you put people in models that are usually just going to the architects?
Oh yeah, I get told to do it because nobody trusts anybody else. Like people go scale blind all the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's even worse.
Is that what you call it? Scale blind. Interesting.
I mean, that's what I call it. But people do it all the time, especially when they're in the computer all day long and they're zooming in and out like yo-yo. It's the only place you get like a consistent scale, and then you want something relative to it. I was going to say, like, the one thing I would be fascinated about, and it's come up through my entire career, is the question about why a model works, what are its advantages and disadvantages, like in a scientific form over the other forms of visualization. I mean, like we work exclusively for Royal Caribbean a lot. It would have been 2019. They have a cave, a VR virtual cave that they walk through these spaces, and I had to build a 16 by 8 foot by 4 foot model in 2 weeks of the same thing they'd been looking at in the cave, because nobody trusted it and no one was getting it. And they're also used as a tool in my world to push people. There seems to be some element of like a technological barrier with the VR stuff. A lot of people will use excuses. There'll be excuses of like, oh, well, it was rushed and blah, 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 blah. But when the physical model's there doesn't seem to be quite as much of an argument about whether it's right or wrong.
Well, that's fascinating. I don't want to keep that. It's actually, I'm really interested in doing a research project very much related to that, which is we have augmented reality and I can wear glasses. The problem that's missing is exactly what you're talking about, is it's called kinesthetic perception of space. You don't understand the walls, the height. So my point is that we can basically take a room and then through augmented reality with our model overlay it on there, which means change the texture of the walls, et cetera, on that space. What if we have CNC routers now and we can make different thicknesses of plywood, we can put textures on it. And so we can make we can make a mock-up with that. When you touch it, it feels like a dense wall, or it can feel like a very hollow, very springy floor. And then we can overlay that with an augmented reality model and walk through it as if it was the building with the sunlight and the birds and these things. And I'm like, this would be interesting. And there was, I show in the book, there's Mies van der Rohe. And I think Peter Behrens first did this. There was these crazy clients in Holland, I think it was, and they couldn't understand the architecture. So they built full-size canvas and wood mock-ups of their house designs, and they were on train track rails, so they can move the house around the site. They did all this, 2 different schemes, and they still didn't do the project.
Well, that's typical. I mean, come on, we all know that. But for me to go, maybe. But to go back to Alistair's point of, personally, I think that, you do the AR, you do the VR, and I think, that people don't believe it can happen because they know in the computer, you can make things float. You can make, a concrete block float. Whereas if we have to build it physically as a model, there's some sort of reality to, I can build that. Do you know what I mean? There's some sort of truth to that. And I think that's a big part of the models that we build. Is like, you can't just make it up. It has to be built physically. So, maybe it makes it more plausible, I guess, in a way.
Well, the fascinating thing is, if I have this, is that, let me see if I can look at my desktop. Let's see here, let's go back here. So this was the concept model that Allied Works did for so materials bring with them associations, and it was a competition for the National Music Center in I think Calgary, Canada. And what was fascinating about it is that it's actually a cheap old saxophone, and that was cast in concrete. And
That's funny.
So when you know that and they didn't have a design, this is what they brought. And I said, this is your building. And it's like the idea was embodied in that the materials carry both cultural and personal and also kinesthetic meaning to them. So it was idea was to create vessels, sound vessels. And the idea is that, and the guy said, oh, this is just like going to a big open air concert where you go from one venue to another and the sound kind of like echoes and then reduces and then goes to another one. And it gets translated into the building quite beautifully. And you can hear as you're going between the different, because it's like, you go to a movie theater, if you're walking down the hallway till you get to your theater, you hear the other like things coming out the door a little bit. He wanted that experience as you're moving around this place, this kind of sense of moving around these vessels. And it was really quite amazing. So there's something about this quality of the materiality that gets carried through in the things that we do.
I hate to do this, but we're kind of out of time. Teresa, do you want to pop in real quick? I know you have hopefully a future if you're Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good
Just
afternoon.
give you a little plug on a future meetup that we're going to have if you want to talk about your book a little, maybe.
Sure, I think Matthew has already done that perfectly. I think he's really right when he describes Theodor Conrad as kind of your ancestor. I would also agree. And yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him and some of the more interesting aspects that are in the book. There's a lot to tell, but hopefully get to know Theodor Conrad a little bit better and see a couple of the models that he built.
When is that book? When is the book being published?
It's already out.
Okay.
It was published a few months ago. Yes.
Okay. And the name of it is?
The name of it is, hold on, I have it here. I can hold it up 1 second.
Just prep for it.
You should read that book is excellent.
The title has changed so many times, so I can't really remember. It's called The Architectural Models of Theodor Conrad, and then the subtitle is The Miniature Boom of Mid-Century Modernism, which refers to the US and is specifically New York.
Excellent. Well,
what's amazing is that Teresa picks this up in the Columbia Archive. They have all of his materials and no one was looking at it.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's really interesting.
Teresa's like, holy crap, look at all this great stuff. What's wrong with you guys?
Why aren't you doing this? That's so funny. Well, I look forward to that, and definitely I'll look for the book. And I don't know, Sam, do you want to do anything for closing? I want to say thank you, Matthew, for coming in. I know I have your email, so I'll probably bother you a bunch more times. So, and thank you again. It was a great discussion, and everybody really look again. The book is The Architectural Model, and it's a really interesting read. I would highly suggest it. So. Thank you again, Matthew. And Sam, do you have anything else in closing?
Yeah, just wanted to say thanks to both of you, Aaron, for keeping us honest and on time, because time is valuable, and for Matthew for giving us your time. It was fascinating. I am not an architectural model maker, but I am very interested in architecture, so it was really fascinating for even me.
I appreciate it.
Appreciate your time.
It's a fun read, an easy read, and I hope that it'll be something through it you might find other work coming out. There's a lot of new stuff coming out nowadays, and it's really worth looking at. Should be wonderful to go through. Cool. Pleasure to meet you all.
Yeah,
nice thank you all. Too. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Bye. Nice to finally see you, Teresa. Teresa and I talked, but we never actually saw each other. Bye.
All
Have a great day, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for
everyone for coming.
joining us. Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.